What is going on YouTube? Francis here. Today we are going to be talking about something extremely important when it comes to running D&D, and that is how the heck do I balance any of these adventures? How do I balance encounters in D&D 5e, especially when it's homebrew monsters? There's this whole challenge rating thing, but I don't really get it. Well, my quick answer to your question is very carefully. And I try to balance encounters, whether it's through challenge rating or on the fly, and this is pretty much my whole entire process of how to do it. And the reason why I do this is so that I can actually prove to myself that I have saved my players in some way, shape, or form. I'm making it fair to them, because before, when I started making homebrew monsters, especially when I was a beginner DM, I killed my players all the freaking time, and my players would come to me and say, hey Francis, this encounter was way too hard, this boss fight was unfair, and you need to dial it down a bit. So this is pretty much how I do it. So I start by answering a series of questions, and I have them written here, so forgive me if I'm looking over here. But the first question is, how difficult do you want the encounter to be? So this encounter, is it a random encounter? Is it a boss fight? Is it a key adventure fight that can kind of switch the the direction of the party? And the reason why I say this is because random encounters will probably be less difficult than boss fights, and boss fights will probably be more deadly. And that's pretty much the first thing that I ask. Second thing is, how many creatures am I running relative to the party? So let's say you have 5 players like I do, and I want to have more creatures. Let's say, I don't know, a group of bandits, or a group of thugs, a family of monsters that are living in a lair, stuff like that. You probably want the CR of the creatures to be less that of the players, otherwise your players will die, right? And that's common sense. But if you have less creatures, let's say you want one really big, bad, evil dude, their stats are probably going to be higher than the parties. So let's say, for instance, that you have a level 5 party. You probably want to have a CR of a 7 or 8 creature. And this is really key, because the answers to these 2 questions will eventually lead into the answers to the other questions. And question number 3 is, does your party have buffs? Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, do they have magical items that boost their combat? Do they have blessings from or boons from deities or patrons? Do they have allies? Maybe they have recruited an NPC in a previous city, or a guild of adventurers or whatnot. Because the more buffs that they have, the more permission you have to, let's say, for instance, give your enemies magic items. And but the thing about this is that you kind of have to play it by ear, because, for instance, if they have allies but no magical weapons, you don't want the allies to be tougher than your players. So you want the allies and the NPCs, the enemies that you're going to be fighting, to be on some level of equal footing, but without overwhelming your party, if that makes any sense. But it basically asks you like a little sub question of how impactful do you want the allies to be, because there's always times when one of the allies gets restrained, they get webbed attacked by a giant spider, and they can't do anything for the entire combat. These are sort of situations that you can suss out. Number 4 is, what is the type of battlefield for the map? And the reason why I ask this is because the CR rating doesn't really matter if the party can't really do anything. And what I mean by this is, will the party have a difficult time getting to their opponents? Like, maybe the party is fighting in a web and everybody is restrained and they can't really do anything, while all of the spiders get advantage is on their crits and everything, and yeah, it's pretty bad. for them. And or maybe there's some like magical barrier, like there's a mirror dimension that the players have to go to in order to fight doppelgangers, and they have to like spend an entire turn just to get to the doppelganger in the mirror world. Stuff like these also need to be taken into consideration. And lastly, is this a lair? Is there lair actions that can actually falter the player or boost the enemy? All of these things need to be taken into consideration, because this is the actual combat. This is where players actually live or die. And lastly, this is sort of might be a controversial thing, but is to really consider the party's composition. So, for instance, if there's fighters, barbarians, rogues, you want to have, if you want to have a villain that will not die in 1 or 2 rounds, you want to have someone that can effectively deal with these types of characters. But you don't want to throw that same villain and then throw them against the party where it's mostly spellcasters, where they are all super easy to take down. And other things that you need to consider, like, is there a healer? Do they have ways to heal? Are healing potions a thing that they have? Because if they don't, then that will come into play here. So those are my 5 questions that I really ask that you consider when deciding on how to balance a encounter. But from here, I like to go to the Create a Monster table in the Dungeon Master's Guide, where I usually find quick stats and to creatures to meet these questions. So just as a quick example, let's say I'm designing a medium to hard city encounter for a level 5 party for and they have a bunch of combat buffs with magic items. So I would start with a CR that's equal to the party's level. So that would be a CR of 5. I would want to run multiple thugs, so let's say 8, just arbitrary, why not, to overwhelm, quote unquote, the party. I would drop the CR from 5 to 3. Now, since the party, let's say they have a rogue, a cleric, and a paladin, well, they're pretty combat heavy. Let's boost the CR back up to 4. The map is close quarters, so since it's in a city, it doesn't really directly benefit either side, so I don't need to change the CR based off of that. And then finally, since they have magic items and the monsters don't, then I'd be willing to boost the CR back to 5. So judging by this, you probably think to yourself, Francis, you just went in a full circle. Well, yeah, but the point is, I actually have proof that I'm doing something right, and I feel good about myself, and I feel more confident, versus if I said, okay, here's a CR 5 creature, let's see if I kill them or not. And, worst case scenario, it's not going to be a TPK. You pretty much prevented a TPK right there. But best case scenario, I would say that, best case scenario meaning that I roll bad or they roll really well. This encounter is a medium encounter. And if this was a random encounter instead, I would drop the CR from 5 to 3. So, or drop it down to 2 and then bring it back up to a 3. So regardless, you end up with a similar result. But the whole point of this is just to feel comfortable with that feeling. Now, part 3 of this video is going to be something a little bit more meaningful. So boss fights and homebrew monsters, and what I change really depends on the context, and I can't really do that in this video, so I'm just going to share the attributes that I tweak and how they affect the game. And as a quick note, I usually modify monster stat blocks in a similar CR and then kind of go from there. And when it comes to abilities and stuff, I try to use the most likely creature that is already made, and then just modify it based off of there. So here goes. First off, health and AC. So what I found is that health and AC doesn't really make the monster more difficult, it just makes them last longer. So I boost health or AC if I want the monster to last more than 1 to 2 rounds. and especially health. Health makes your monster just not beefier, but makes them last more than 1 to 2 seconds. And AC is for, and I boost the AC when the party is a bunch of fighters, barbarians, rogues, players that are really built for combat. Saving throws are usually based on proficiency modifiers of that challenge rating. So let's say the party has a +2 in proficiency and there are multiple creatures in that case. I would probably have them roughly the same proficiency or maybe even less. Or if it's one creature and the party of 5, I would have the creature have a bigger proficiency bonus than the party. It's all about balance. Now, stats should be, in my opinion, stats should be similar to the party, but with other considerations. Like, if a monster is huge, it should have a higher strength or a higher con than most of the party. And if the party's highest stat is a 20, I'd make the highest villain's stat a 20. And I'm not going to make it like, I'm going to make the stats equivalent to the parties, but it's really the abilities and the health and the legendary actions that really propel the encounter versus, you know, something like the stats. Spell save DCs are similar to the player class, using different stats. And ability checks and saving throws, ability saves DCs are arbitrary, to me at least, on how much the monster relies on the ability. So like if I have a Homebrew sword spider I used in a previous game, I would have the ability save DC of a web attack to be higher than what is a giant spider, basically. And if they rely on it a lot, I boost it a little bit. Multi-attacks, I usually base it on the total damage output based on the table, so that's kind of how it is. And then for actions and abilities, and, you know, like, can they go invisible? Can they fly? Do they have a giant swim speed? Do they have a running start that deals an extra damage? Regardless of what it is, regardless of anything, my rule of thumb is that the more abilities that they have, the less combative they are, and the more flexible they are. And the less abilities, the more combat heavy they are. And the best thing I can say about this is how you design your encounters. Do you want it to be a full-on battle? Do you want it to be like a game of cat and mouse where the villain is running around the map? Maybe like in my most recent game where the creature went invisible and the party cannot see or detect anything. So like I said, keep it simple regardless of your encounter goes. Just worry about the number of things that you have to keep track of. And that's my final take. And that's it for this video. Really long one right now. Hope you were able to bear with me on this, but don't feel so bad about jumping between the different parts if you need to rewatch a certain thing. If you found this helpful in some way, please let me know by hitting the like button down below and subscribe to the YouTube channel because I post new videos every single week. And if you want another helpful video, be sure to check this one out about how I recommend role-playing in D&D. You don't need a funny voice. You don't need to be a voice actor. And I hope to see you there. So, peace.